So let's start off with the private sector perspective with Ms. itself. And given your vantage point, you heard the perspective from Montserrat on the overall frame of what countries are struggling with. We will also hear a little later on the higher education perspective. What are private sector looking for in terms of quality graduates coming out of universities? Or do they want the right mix between vocational training and higher education?
So, it's a big burden to represent the private sector. So, I'm going to start by saying that I think education is extremely important in the studies that we've done. Education plays a huge part in influencing one of the things that you already probably have a lot of, which is called productivity. And sometimes it is actually a much more important driver than a lot of the talks we hear about big trains and a big chunky investment in potentially hard infrastructure. And sometimes it's easier to understand and quantify than what we call the soft skills and the soft infrastructure. But I wanted to go maybe to give you a little bit of a broader concept of what I think that I would say the three key challenges that especially the Western economies are facing at the moment. And maybe with a little bit of emphasis on the UK, given that we're based here today. I think beyond education, the skills, the key problems that we have are productivity. We have very low productivity and not much progress there, and we don't really know why that is happening. We also have an issue with inclusion. We've seen that with some of the referendum and the elections elsewhere. And we have related to that, an issue with a relatively large chunk of households that are what we call inactive in terms of economics. So how do you bring that segment of society back into the economy, back into a more, if you like, normal or beneficial integration of our economy and society? And then finally, we do tend to have more regional disparity now than before, and specifically in the UK, this is one of the issues that we have. And then, given that I have 2 seconds left, I'd say one of the things two of the things that I would like to see from the education sector is one, more links to businesses. We know that one of the key things that businesses need in order to improve productivity is linkages to the international markets or to peers internationally. Academia, given that it is quite international, is one area where they can help businesses. And another one is the obvious one is R&D. How can you help particularly small businesses with that so that they can improve productivity? And then on the inclusiveness, how can you make sure that those schools that excel somewhere in the country can actually have links with those that don't? Because we in business are trying to do more mentoring for those companies that are failing. Can you get that for schools as well? And can you get universities to go to the schools in the areas that are failing and give the youngsters the inspiration to study? Because some of it is not so much the distance you get from what I see, it's not so much the quality, but the inspiration and the vision. There's the world down there for them.
Thank you very much, Jane. So David, from the perspective of, I want to bring the discussion back to globalization and the backlash that we are seeing. From your vantage point running a global university, what are some of the challenges that you are seeing? And also to Yale's point, are we turning out sufficiently good quality graduates who are equipped to deal with the challenges of the new economy?
Well, I'm obviously going to say not from, of course, I would say that. I think the excellence keynote lays out a really important challenge to our education. That is how we deal with technology. In a world where I don't see any end to the globalization process anytime soon, because the underlying forces are logistically resistant, whatever barriers might be faced over the coming years. And I'd like to anchor what I want to say in a quote that my colleagues Tom Shirley found. You repeat and Vince play it out at a presentation we spoke. And this quote says, thousands of students yet unborn will pass along the corridors and learn in lecture rooms and wrest the secrets of nature in the laboratories. They want the link still more closely in history science, add to the order of the city, help to increase the well-being of our nation. That sounds like a very modern mission statement, doesn't it? Because it talks to talent development, it talks to work with industry, it talks to fundamental science, and it talks to civic responsibility. That was written by Sir Jesse Booth in 1928, when the University of Nottingham moved to University Park. And my point is that's still a very current mission, 90 years on, having gone through the second industrial revolution. Now I think this third industrial revolution that our keynote speaker laid out is likely to be more disruptive. And I think the big challenge for universities is how we make place continue to be relevant. I think place will continue to be relevant insofar as people will still want to come to places like Nottingham to learn, to engage, to undertake research. But technology will mean that because they're changing their jobs more regularly, because there are more choices of the places that they go to, we have to think very carefully about the way in which we deliver. Because this is in honor of Lord Deering. Lord Deering spoke about lifelong learning. I think we're coming into an era of lifelong students, if I can put it that way, because the notion that you will register at age 18 and get 360 credits over 3 years and leave with a degree, and that's the end of it, may be becoming an outdated notion. It might be a case of doing a year, doing a job for 3 or 4 years, going back to do your second year, maybe in a different place, maybe in the same place. And we'll have to think very carefully about that. We'll have to think very carefully about the kind of skills that we need to equip our learners with, whatever their age. Because they have to deal with more complexity, more ambiguity. They have to be more adaptable, they have to deal with more risk. That means get them to think in a very different way. And we still will have to deliver for our communities to your challenge. What do we do for these communities where there is exclusion, where there is a problem with aspiration? And your challenge is a fair one. It's a challenge the government has laid out firmly to us through the Office for Fair Access. And quite a number of us are getting out into those communities. We sponsor 3 schools in Nottingham. They are in leafy suburbs, quite potential. There are areas of great educational challenge to try and raise aspiration. So our challenge will be equipping those that come through the conventional route, re-equipping those that are leaving the labour force and going back into the labour force, but continuing to add value to these communities where disadvantage is ingrained, and where we have to do more about that. Final point to make is, Jesse Group did envisage a great civic university that was very comfortable working with business. We are very comfortable working with business. Just this morning, we launched at the Royal Society a new research strategy anchored around 6 beacons of excellence. That's about research. It's also about translation of that research in collaboration with government, with business, with other partners in civil society. Very important.
Thank you, Dr. Sidney. Dr. Newman, I'm going to turn to you now to provide a perspective on the Commonwealth. And we increasingly read about the Commonwealth, particularly in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. The Commonwealth is not a contiguous grouping of nations. It's not a continent. It's not a country. And it includes island nations in the Caribbean, it includes South Africa and India. How can we, from a higher education perspective, what is the ACU doing to weave all of this together and connect the Commonwealth nations with the UK?
So first I would say that it is the variety and diversity of the Commonwealth nations that makes it such a unique set of 52 countries. And if you think about small, fragile island states alongside large islands like Australia and the UK, and then you think about the most pressing global challenges of our time, for example, oceans, global migration, environmental issues, and you bring the convening power of these Commonwealth countries or their universities and their powerhouses. So I think one of the largest problems for Commonwealth countries and beyond in our alliances and the way we work together is how do we deal with those growing numbers of people who need to reach higher education. And I'm very grateful for the slides that you showed because they demonstrate the importance of higher education. It is for the first time included in the Sustainable Development Goals, and it is in danger at times in some countries, the UK and Australia, of being left behind because people focus very much on, in many cases, necessarily primary education. But between 2000 and 2014, we've gone from 100 million to 270 million people accessing higher education. We've gone from a gross enrolment of something like 17% to 34%. Where are these people going to access that higher education? Because not all countries where they access primary and tertiary will be able to supply it. So you'll have seen a massive increase as well in accessing higher education, and not just through the traditional routes of scholarships and schemes to countries like the UK and the US. So how do we work together? And that's one of the things the AC is very interested in mobilising the expertise of universities like Nottingham and others, global universities, that can actually provide partnerships to provide access to higher education. And then from that links to industry and skills. On one hand, universities are the powerhouses that are creating the new technologies that are changing and disrupting the world. And on the other hand, they're often accused of not having enough of skill to work with industry. But I'd also challenge industry to help universities think about how they work together more. It's a two-way partnership. And some universities and industries do it incredibly well. I can think of many UK examples. But there are also, universities are very difficult institutions to navigate, and that's in a sense our responsibility. But businesses also have their own drivers, and perhaps explaining those more to the universities might help. And that sort of applied relationship that will help to train future graduates.
Thank you very much. Well, David Willett, since you're the only political representative on this panel, I'm going to resist the temptation of saying this is all because of bad politics. I want to get your perspective from a public policy, political leaders challenge here in the UK. What should UK authorities be doing to define, because Brexit or no Brexit, the problem of building those quality jobs, making sure that everyone, if you have an inclusive growth strategy, making sure that everyone in society benefits equally. This is a profound public policy challenge. So from your vantage point, what are the few things that our political leaders should do immediately?
To start with, could I just say a word about one of the reasons why we're all here today? We're all here today because David is coming towards the end of his time as Vice Chancellor of Nottingham. And I would just like to say that I think Mr. David has been a fantastically wise and shrewd advisor on higher education policy as a whole, and also a fantastic Vice Chancellor of Nottingham, and actually celebrated. I think that's one of the reasons why we are all here today. And it's great that it's being celebrated as well by the announcement both of a £200 million research programme and a gold star at TEF, which is a good compliment to have. On the questions of public policy, there are two former ministers here. Let me comment on the former minister's presentation, because there are two observations that arise from that and show what public policy can do. First of all, there are still very high returns to higher education. And contrary to the easy view, well, the more graduates you have, so returns might fall, we're actually in a world where, despite the number of graduates rising, returns in most countries remain high. And I think that's a very important point. So it tells us that one of the crucial roles of government is to continue to grow our education and to find a sustainable way of paying for that growth. And the second slide I wanted to comment on was the slide which tried to show different ways of paying for that growth. And Britain was in the column, England was in the column marked private fees and treated the same way as the US. And I have long had this argument with the OECD statisticians. My view is that regard the way that we finance higher education in England as being the same as the way in which they finance higher education in the US is a very misleading picture. And if we abolished our universal loan scheme and graduate repayment and just said every student has to pay up front for their higher education, that would be a massive, we would all understand, that would actually be a massive change in the way in which higher education is funded in England. But we're not sure it was a change at all in that OECD slide. And the challenge that we had was, again, let's go back to David's important one. There was a really important article in an economic journal by David about 15 years ago now, which tracked spending on different elements of education and showed declining public spending per student in higher education. And the challenge which that article set for policymakers was to find some way of reversing that extremely regrettable trend. And there is a utopian way of reversing it, and there's a practical way. The utopian way is to say, well, government should just devote ever higher public spending to universities. And the fact is that in Britain and in many other countries, getting university education to the top of the list of priorities for limited public resources during times when money is tight is very difficult indeed. The alternative way, the smarter way, is to say we need to find some other way of funding our education, which doesn't depend on the public purse, but nevertheless does deliver access. It's not pure private payment. And I would argue that the model that was introduced initially by Tony Blair and re-extended is, and has been described by the OECD as one of the few sustainable models, is the right way forward. It rises to the challenge of getting more money to our education. It recognises the reality it's hard to do that through public spending. It avoids the perils of the American model of requiring students to pay up front. And so I think, so what we need to do is to reinforce that and extend it to master's students and to PhDs. So we're in a world of high returns to graduates, constraints on public resources, and a graduate repayment scheme is the right model. But it should, and we should be absolutely upfront about aiming for further expansion. That involves further expansion in the number of students and also further expansion in the number of universities.
So David, I want to hear from you before we open the floor for questions. From the perspective of the university, how easy or difficult it is to meet the challenge of increasing the pipeline and making sure that the quality is maintained?
So on the funding, I think what Brooks is absolutely right. I do think publicly funded loan scheme is much more reputable, much more sustainable than upfront fees. I've always supported a rebalancing of contributions to higher education, never been a fan of upfront fees. The challenge of expansion, at the end of the day, that should be inevitable. So long as we have diversity within the system, so long as we don't have several hundred universities who are all trying to do the same thing, so long as we have some that specialist institutions, so long as we have some that specialize on the technical skills that are required through degree apprenticeships or whatever, then I don't see any difficulty in expanding participation in higher education, which is not the same as ever increasing the number of universities.
I was just trying to make a general point where you're right. And the OECD has always supported the loans system in the UK as one of the few sustainable systems as expansion of higher education continues. point that I was trying to make is that when people look at the fees, the general interpretation is, oh, in some countries the fees are very high, and therefore this is a barrier for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds to enter university, while in others they're low, and therefore it's more inclusive and so on. And the point I was trying to make is that one way or the other, families always pay, whether it's through the families of students going to university are paying fees through loans or just straightforward, or through taxes. And which system is best depends on the context. I mean, you have countries in Northern Europe where families pay really high taxes and then they can afford to have no fees, and that's okay. In other countries, it's different. What it's important is that the system is sustainable, and when there are fees or
maybe we can start off by taking 3 questions together. You will raise your house colleagues with microphones. Excellent, we have a question.
Hi, I'd just like to
Perhaps
ask...
you can identify yourself.
Sorry, I'm Alex Miles from the University of Nottingham. I'd like to ask the panel a question about to what extent are the models that we're talking about in terms of the numbers of demand for education predicated on this assumption that globalization is going to continue in the same way that it has done previously. So the second part of this title is on resurgent nationalism. And is there any reflections that I'm going to make on whether that's going to see a fundamental shift in the way that careers are going to be developed globally, nationally, and the wider implications of some of the political change we've seen in the last couple of years?
Who wants to take this first? Sunil.
Well, I shouldn't. What my colleague
I can just say one of few things. I think one of the key things is thinking about the linkages in terms of productivity, but also in terms of your customers. So, for example, we've seen a big shift, a big rise in students, in international students that have meant that they have a very positive contribution for funding in universities. So, if we're seeing a shift from that, we're seeing more pressure on student numbers in countries like UK, but also elsewhere. And also, if we're seeing students that are thinking twice in terms of the benefits, because even if they're going to go and study in a different country, the possibility of them working and getting work experience in those countries is going to diminish. That will make them think again. So, globalization or barriers to globalization could impact universities potentially quite significantly, but also could impact global productivity as a result.
No, that's very optimistic. If you look at OECD forecasts, last time I looked a year or so ago, there were about 2.2 million students that study outside their country of domicile. So that's going to double by 2025. Okay, that's essentially demand driven. Now, unless we see really tough barriers going back to international mobility, and I think the probability of that is quite low. I know there's a fairly fair-ground debate with the UK around that at the moment, but I'd remind you that numbers of international students, although they're flat, have not gone down very much in recent years in the UK. It's still the second biggest market relative to the US. That's not to say that we still got work to do to continue to persuade government that international students should be in net migration figures, that we need them for all kinds of reasons, diversity of our institutions, sustainability of some programs. But quite out with what's happening in the UK, actually, Australia, Canada, the United States, China, these are all countries that recruit more international students. So I think mobility will continue. That's good.
You have a question here?
Thanks, Steve Spalding, Department of International Trade. So I work a lot with companies that are developing their business overseas. And they all eventually come to the point of what I call make or buy. That's the make or buy inputs going in on the production side, but also on the skill side. So when it comes to employing the right people, and a company has to decide whether or not they pay the very top dollar to get the right people in place, which is the buy, or they take the punt to actually develop the employees over a longer period, which follows Sir David's idea of lifelong employment. It's very difficult for companies at the moment to make that call. Cash is tight, and it's a rocky environment. And I just wondered if there was any guidance from the panel as to how that would best be developed.
Let me turn to you, given your previous policy role, number 10 and HMT. How can strategic planning and strategic planning on the part of the government, strategic planning on the part of the private sector, where do they converge?
The evidence in Britain is rather dispiriting that, if anything, spend on training of staff in the UK is declining. I think that's a bad thing. I also think that one of the areas where this problem is now most acute is within the public sector. Historically, the public sector was quite an enlightened employer, and was quite good at bringing people on, funding training courses, getting people extra qualifications that enable them to be promoted within a school, within a hospital, within a care. One of the areas where public spending has been reduced in the past few years in those services has been funding those sorts of programs. And if I was in the shoes of my successors at the moment, with after the 2017 election an agenda around public services, I wouldn't simply succumb to the pressures for higher public sector pay. I would expand the established programs for increased training and educational opportunities for people working within public services. So it means both of tackling shortages and reviving what used to be one of their historic strengths.
Yes.
I think the main problem in relation to that is that the landscape has changed dramatically. So it's a problem for education systems, for businesses, and for governments. So it used to be the case that if you went through the education system and you went all the way up to higher education and you specialized in a sector, you had really high chances of getting a job, either a job for life or at least a job in that sector. No longer so. Young people are unlikely to keep a job for very long, are unlikely to be able to work in the same sector. They need to be prepared in school and university for jobs that will exist in 10, 20 years' time. We can't predict today, so one of our problems is anticipating the skills need. And it's such a big problem that some people have completely given up on it because things are evolving so quickly. So it really is a challenge that needs bridging and establishing links between the rapidly evolving labour market and the education system, which used to be the case only for vocational training. And now in many countries, vocational training, which tended to be like a second choice for most people, is becoming really important because the links with the labour market are very close, the degrees are shorter, they are evolving more quickly, they are giving high levels of employability. The same needs to happen to universities and I would say to schools. Because otherwise the education system cannot keep up with such rapid changes without establishing direct links with the labour market where the changes are happening. And this is why productivity is low, because even if you have a high level of education attainment, if you can't keep upskilling yourself on the different skills that the labour market will demand from you in 5, 10 years' time, then you're going to be in trouble. And I think the weakest level is what we call adult lifelong learning. In most countries, I think it's not doing the right job.
Just a supplementary point, which is that employers need culturally aware graduates who can work in many different environments, and also employers want languages. Neither languages are at risk, I think, and outward mobility, particularly from a UK perspective, is at risk because it isn't funded in the same way as Australia, for example, for its Colombo plan, or Brazil, for its Science Without Borders, that made a real difference and an impact. I think schools play a part by investing in STEM, in inspiring ways of teaching, in trying to find ways to inspire teachers to teach languages in a way that brings up a new generation. Because although we have fantastic programs with Mandarin now, and Arabic in some schools, we are losing our other languages. And we're closing down, so this debate around nationalism and closing borders, you know, Theresa May challenges us to be a citizen of nowhere and a global citizen. Well, it's coming true if we stop speaking languages, if we stop encouraging our students and graduates to spend some time overseas. And lastly, the traditional way of spending time overseas, a year or a semester, is often out of reach of the majority of people. But smaller periods of time, summer schools or internships, alliances with industries, businesses that can be linked to universities, is a really good way of doing it and reaches out to a much greater cohort.
You come to one question. Go ahead.
So, Jessica Corner from University of Nottingham. I think it's really interesting painting that picture of 50% of jobs going in the next, the digital revolution. And we've been talking about the response to higher education is to expand to address the problem. I'm just wondering whether the panel might think whether there are other roles for higher education in inventing a new future in which 50% of the jobs we know today are gone, but the actual environment in which the future jobs might exist, rather than just the response of preparing individuals to work in a world which we can't yet describe. What's the role of universities in inventing the new future?
Interdisciplinary approaches, thinking about problems in different ways. For example, in engineering, no longer having siloed engineering departments that don't talk to each other, but thinking about problem-solving ways and bringing in the social sciences and humanities, challenging faculties and academics to think differently, to think about the problem and how to solve it, rather than the traditional academic discipline. Bringing new people into the universities, having practice professors, having people from industry teaching students, thinking about new technologies, and making sure that the curriculum reflects the changing world and the way, and the fact that many students and young people are already developing apps or science outside the university and outside the classroom. So it's a real challenge for the university also to think administratively about how it's going to be up to date and challenge students in a way that they are already being challenged outside the university walls.
So I agree, certainly in terms of getting those who are in university, students of whatever age, to think about complex issues, to think about ambiguity, to think about context, cultural, ethnic, whatever, really important. But of course, the other bit of your question, I think, is the role we have in actually making the future, and this is where the research-based, the translation of that research into new activities, new industries, is so important. You know, when you think of some of the things we discussed this morning around chemicals, around the factories of the future, around the digital revolution, we've got faculty, we've got students living through that, but we also have collaborators in business, in government, in schools, and I think it's joining all of those up. So there's a bit more preparedness for change, because that's the heart of it for me. Just more preparedness for change, and more willingness to adapt to change.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've unfortunately run out of time. I want to thank you for taking the time to attend the event. Please join me in thanking